Hey everyone and welcome to this video. About 15 hours ago, there was a new release which is the RC-0 release candidate 0 of 19.2.0, which means this is not stable and not available to everyone. But we can actually see that there is a really nice feature that landed in this particular release, which is the HTTP resource. And this makes it so easier for Angular applications to fetch data and combine that within the signals reactivity, which everybody is hyped about, everybody loves it. And this is a really great step to move towards signals and reactive paradigms. And if you want, you can actually see the code that involves in the PR. But if you're not really a senior developer, I won't suggest to go inside and see what's happening here. Instead of that, we are actually going to go and use JSON placeholder API to build our own little application, which will use the HTTP resource to fetch data. And it would also work in a reactive manner that we'll see and experience together. So this is a hands-on video that you can follow along as well. In order for you to test this out, if you wanted to start your application from scratch, the way would be to copy this and then you go to your terminal and then you first install the latest version of Angular CLI 19.2.0 RC-0 and then you run ng version or ng -- version to see the version. But I don't want you to do that because I've already created an application with this particular version that has the HTTP resource available. So you can find the link in the description of this video, and what I want you to do is to do a git clone and you use the link that's in the description. Once done, you can open that into your VS Code or the editor of your choice. I have that already in my VS Code opened, and then you want to go and say git checkout start, so you're on the same branch as me, and then you can follow along. First of all, if you have not run npm install to just install the packages for this Angular app, you need to do that. And when you're done, you can essentially run npm start, which will run this application on localhost 4200. Now that this is running, I can go to my browser, and if I refresh, you can see that we have a heading Angular HTTP resource, we have some dummy users right here, and then we have to-dos. The idea is to show only the users to-dos. If you look at the JSON placeholder API sort of documentation, you'll see that we have two kind of responses. One is this one in which we get users. So here you can see JSON placeholder.typecode.com/users. This gives us a bunch of users. Then we have another endpoint, which is users/id/to-do. So notice that the one here is the ID of the user. And if we change this particular ID, then we get to-dos of another user. So they are going to be different. So we need to implement both of these things in our application just like this. So let's actually get started. The first thing I want to do is to create services to contain these resources, because that's the way to go. We define our resources in our services and the components use those services in general. So the component does not know where the data comes from. They just know that there's a service that provides me data, and that makes it easier to test these components as well, because you can always mock your services. So what I'm going to do here is I can say ng generate service, and I'm going to call this to-dos. So this creates a to-dos service inside my app folder just here. Then we are also going to create one for users just like this. So now we are going to start with the user service, so we can implement an HTTP resource for users. Here I can go and say this is going to be a users resource, and here I'm going to call HTTP resource, and you can already see that the IntelliSense tells me that because it's available now in this particular version. And the way to implement a resource is just to provide the URL. This is the easiest way of implementing an HTTP resource. So I can go to my browser, and here I will copy the URL for this users endpoint. So copy this, go back here, and then you can paste it just like this. And that's pretty much it. We have a get call that we can make with this endpoint, and that gives us signals that we can use in our component. So we have a signal for loading, we have a signal for the data that comes back, and also if there is an error. So I'm going to just save this, and we are going to go to the component to actually try out this resource. So here we can say we have a users service, and we can say inject, and here we can say users service just like this. You can either have user service right here, or you can have the resource. Since I'm not going to work with anything apart from the resource, here I can actually say users resource directly, and right after injection you can say users resource. So we are directly mapping to the users resource here. Then I can go to my HTML, and if you see, our HTML is structured in a way that we have the main, then we have a section, and inside the section we have two elements. We have the aside where we show the users, and then we have a div where we show the to-dos of a particular user. So we're going to go into aside here, and you can see already we have a list here. So just above the list, I'm going to start typing @4, which brings us with the for loop, and I'm going to say for each user of, and here instead of items I can say user resource dot, and here I can say value. The value is something that should be the array of users that we should loop over, but here you can see that the value here is unknown. If you mouse over user resource, you can see that this is an HTTP resource ref of type unknown. We don't want unknown here. We know that we are going to have users, so this should be typed properly for TypeScript. So for that, you need to go to your user service and we are going to define the type of the user here. If you look at the API endpoint, you can see that we have the ID here, the name, username, and a bunch of things, but we are only interested in two things: the ID of the user, because we use that to get the user's to-dos, and then the name, because we need to show the name right here in our application on the left side. So what we should do here is we can say export type user, and here we need to say the ID is going to be of type number and the name is going to be of type string. And here, just before this small bracket, we can define the type. So we can say here we are going to retrieve back an array of users, and that solves the issue. If I go back to my HTML now and mouse over users resource, you can see that we have an HTTP resource ref of an array of users or undefined, which is better than unknown for now. Now I can go here inside, and instead of having these li, I can actually put that. So I'm going to actually move this for inside the UL. So we have UL, then we have for starting here, and then we should have a single li that will be looped over for each user. So I can remove the second li from here, right? Now, instead of showing user here, I can say curly brackets, and here I can say user, which is this user running in the loop dot, and you can see already we have ID and name here. Super cool. Now, if I save this and go back to my browser, you can see nothing works because we forgot one thing, and that is that the HTTP resource is based on the HTTP client. So if I right click this, go to inspect, you should be able to see the error clearly here, which says that we are trying to use user service, but it requires HTTP client and we don't have anything provided for HTTP client. The way to fix this is you go to your app config TS, and here in the providers, you provide the HTTP client. So provide HTTP client just like this. And if we save this, go back to our browser, you can already see now we are getting the actual users. Super nice. If I refresh now, you can see that we don't show anything for a while and then we actually show the result. I think we can do better. Instead of just not showing anything, we can show a loader. And in the application, we already have a component called loading spinner, which we can use. So I'm going to go to my app component HTML again, and here I'm going to check if this request or this resource is loading, and if yes, then we show the loader. So instead of this UL, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it and I'm going to say if we have a situation where the user's resource dot is loading, then we show the app loading spinner just like this, and then we go ahead and say else we should show something else. So in this case, I also want to see if there's an error. So I'm going to go and say if we have users resource dot error, if that's the case, then we also should be able to show an error. So this is not supposed to be else, but else if. And then here we basically render the error just like this. So we can go here and say user resource dot error just like this. Else we should go inside and have the UL just like this. Now you can see that this throws an error because I need to go to my TypeScript file actually, and I need to import this here. So I should say something like loading in the or loading spinner component, save this just like this, and then I can go to my HTML. This is happy. I can save this now. Now if I go back to my application and refresh, you can see that we have the loader which is being shown here briefly. Now there are two problems. One, this loader is not centered, which I don't really like, and second, it's not white. It has a gray color which is really bad for contrast. So I can go back and do two things. One, this actually has a color attribute that I can provide, and I can say white here. Second, I can actually wrap this inside a div or a span, and I can say that it should be text centered. So I can use a div here and say class text center, and then I can go ahead and paste this just like this. Now if I go back and refresh, you can see we have a nicer loader compared to what we had before. Now the reason why this is not really centered is that this area is the one that's the sidebar, but we also have some black color because I think the container is black. So what we can do is we can go ahead and remove this BG Slate 900 from here and put it directly on the side, and then you'll see that it would feel more like that it's centered. Now if I go back and refresh, you can see it's still kind of centered, which means that we are still missing something. So let's go and fix this in a debugging way. So I can go here and just say not here, so this shows all the time, and now we can inspect what's wrong. So here you can see that we have this div which is this big, then we have the app loading indicator which is this, and then we have this div that is text centered. So what we can do is that we can give this a max width and an MX auto. So we can go here and say text center max width fit, and here we can say MX auto, save this, and we go here, you can see that now this is centered. So I can go back and remove this exclamation from here, and now when we refresh, you can see the loader comes in, and then we also can show the list of users. Now let's talk about what happens when we have an error. In this particular case, we should be able to show the error. So if I go back to user service and I completely change the endpoint, something like this, and save. Now if we refresh, you can see that we show this object, which is not really human friendly, but there are different ways to show the actual error. So one of the things that you could do is you can take out the user's resource error in a computed. So here you can say users resource error, and here we can either send null or actually the message. So here we can say computed, and the computed will basically look into the user's resource error. So here we can say something like const error equals equals, and here we can say users or this dot users resource dot error, just like this. And we can also say we can take this as an error. If we don't have error, then we just return null. Otherwise, we return the error dot message. That's the whole idea. So if I save this now, I can actually use this users resource error directly in my template. So I can go here and I can say if the users resource error exists, which is supposed to be a signal, then we can also show that. But this is not just like this. We have to also extract out from here as well. So we can say users resource error, and now is a time where we should probably refactor this. So we are going to say here we have users service, and we just inject that, and then we go here and we say something like error is this dot user service, or we actually don't need this at all. We're gonna just use user service. So I save this, I go to my component, and here I can say user service dot, and here user service dot users resource dot error. Actually, this should be exactly the same thing. So I save it like this, and then we also should have user service dot user resource dot value. So I can save this just like this. Now if I go here, you can see we show the error HTTP failure response for the particular URL. So we actually are showing error. This is just one way of showing the error. You can also try different approaches as well. Now that we have fixed this, we can actually go back and fix our URL, which was actually users. So we actually get the users, and now you can see we are getting the users. Now let's talk about the to-do service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually copy this. I'm going to go to to-do service, and I'm going to go and do it like this. So we can say to-dos resource, and here we need to import HTTP resource, and instead of user, we are going to actually use the type to-do. So we can say export type to-do, and here we need to have a couple of things. User ID, which is a number. We have the ID, which is a number. We also have title, which is a string, and then we also have completed, which is Boolean. So inside of user here, we can say to-do, and inside of users, we can say users /1 to-dos, hard coding it for now. Now we can save this. We can go to app component TS, and we can start including to-do service. So here we can say to-dos service equals inject, and here we can say to-do service, just like this. And we can go ahead and start using to-dos. So I can go to my HTML, and here I'm going to close this aside and go to my div here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually use to-do service, but I can actually copy paste a lot of code from top. So here I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to come back here and paste it like this. And then we can actually move this sort of UL, cut it from here, and then we can paste it inside here, the UL. And now I just want to replace this. So what we want to do is that instead of looping over the user service, we want to loop over the to-do service. So I'm going to cut this one li, and I'm going to start having a for loop here where I can say to-do item of, and here we can say to-do service dot to-dos resource dot value, which should be a list of to-dos. And inside here, we can go ahead and put this li. One more thing that we should do is, since we have a unique user ID, we should be, instead of using index, we should say user.id. Similarly, we should here have to-do.id. Now that we have this, or to-do item.id, sorry. Now we can go ahead and say, instead of to-do one, we are going to actually render to-do item dot, and here we have the title that we want to render. Great. Now that we have this, we can actually remove this UL, and then we can also replace this user service from to-do service and to-do resource. So I'm going to also say to-do resource, to-do service right here. But for the error, we probably need to do the same thing as we did for user service. So I'm going to actually copy this thing, going to to-do service right here. And then we're going to say to-dos resource error. We import the computed, and we also go ahead and copy this. Now we can go here, and then we can say to-dos service or to-dos resource error. And we are also going to use it just like this. Now we have the same thing for to-dos, and we have the same thing for users. Let's save this. Now when I refresh, you can see that both of the calls go at the same time. Both of them bring the results, and by default the to-dos ones brings the result of the first user, and that's pretty nice. Actually, we can see all the to-dos right here, but we don't really want to do this. We want to bring the to-dos of a particular user. So for that, we can actually make this a bit more reactive. And for this, inside the to-do service, we are going to create a signal on the basis of which the to-dos resource would react and would re-trigger the request. So the first thing is to create a user signal here. So this is going to be a signal, and this is going to be either of type user, which we need to import from user service, or this is going to be null by default. So we are going to call this null in the beginning. Now that we have this, instead of having a hard-coded string, we are going to use a function approach right here. And this should basically return a string similarly, but we're going to include not the hard-coded ID here, but actually the user's ID, which we have set here. So here we can say this dot user dot, and here we can say ID. So use it like this, and then we have ID. Now you'll notice that automatically TypeScript added this question mark here because this user can be null or could be a user. So we need to handle this situation. When the user is null, we don't really want to trigger to-dos at all, which means that we can do something like this here. We can say const user equals this dot user, and then we can say if we don't have a user, please don't trigger an API call, which means I can simply say return undefined. Whenever you return undefined from a resource, the actual loader function doesn't really trigger, which means in HTTP resources case, there will be no HTTP call if the function returns undefined. Instead of undefined, when we actually return the right URL, then the HTTP call would trigger. So here I can basically save this now. And now if I go to my browser, you can see already that we do make the user's call, but we never make the to-dos call. And that is because we never set the user signal ourselves. So let's try to set the user signal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my app component HTML, and in here, whenever we click a particular user, which is right here, the list item, then we should set the user. So here I can say whenever you click here, we should simply say to-do service dot user dot set, and here we can pass this user in the loop. This is directly setting the signal of the to-do service, which should basically react and make the API call. So if I click here, you can see that we sent a call. We sent a call for the user with ID 1. Now if I click the second one, you can see we get the to-dos for the second user, because now we send the call of the user having the ID 2. Similarly, we can go ahead and we can try out different users here, and every time there's an API call, you can also see there's a loader that actually works just like this. And this loader actually should not be white. I'm going to go back and see the loader here where we are passing the color white. So I will remove this. So we have a loader that's dark. So now if I refresh now, click here, you can see the loader that's here is actually black. Pretty nice. Now this is not really a good UI, because either I should say here, click a user to get their to-dos, or I should basically set the first user as selected, which triggers the to-dos for me. We can do either of those. In my case, I want to show you how we can make it happen that when the page loads, we basically set the first user into the to-do service and then we get the to-dos. So for that, there are many approaches. One of the approaches, which is the easiest, is I actually add an effect in here in the app component. So I can go here and say constructor, and the constructor will have an effect. So I can say effect coming from Angular core. And in here, I basically get the user service or the user resources users. So here I say const users equals, and I can say here we have this dot user service dot user resource dot value. And this value, what can it be? If I mouse over, it can be users array or undefined, which means I need to check here if it's not undefined, which means if we actually have users, then I set the first user on to do service. So here I can check if users dot length, and when I do this, you're gonna see that automatically this adds a question mark here because it could be undefined as well. But I'm gonna keep it like this, and we have no user assigned. So I can say this dot to do service dot user. If not this value, which means that there's no user set, then we're gonna simply say this dot to do service dot user dot set, and we basically set the first user. So we can say users 0, the first user, right? Now I don't really want this use case to happen at all. I don't want question mark here because I want to say there should be an array all the time. That array could be empty, but when we actually get the data from the API, then we have users, actual users. But by default, why should it be undefined? And why should I have to put it like this? So another way of working with resources is that sometimes you can also set the default value, and that's the same for the HTTP resource. So I can go to users resource, and the first argument to this particular function is the URL. I can actually add a second argument just like this, and I can say default value, and here I can provide an empty array. Now if I go back to my app component and mouse over the resource, you can see that we don't have undefined anymore. It's always going to be an array. That's what we want. So now I don't have to have this question mark at all, and things look much nicer. If I go back to my application now, you can already see we have to-dos, but let's refresh, and you can see that first we get the users, and as we get the users, we send our first call for the first users to-dos. Pretty nice, right? The last thing I want to do in this tutorial is to highlight which users to-dos are we looking at. So you can see that when we mouse over, we actually highlight this a bit, but let's also highlight based on the selected user. So I'm going to go to my app component HTML, and here you can see that we have a bunch of styles for the users right here. So we have text ember, and we also have this border bottom as well. So I'm going to copy those two, and we are going to add the styles like this. So we can say class dot text ember 400, and we want to do that when this particular user in the loop has the same ID as the to do service dot user if the user exists dot ID. If that's the same, then we basically highlight it just like this. The same goes for another class that we have here, which is border b ember 300. So I'm going to go and replace this guy. And now if we save this and go back to our browser, you can see that we do have the color highlighted, but there's no border. If I switch the user, you can see that still the color is highlighted. Pretty nice. And that is because how the CSS specificity work and how Tailwind CSS adds the layered utilities versus the component utilities, etc. So here you can see that we are actually applying this class, but that's being overridden by this border be transparent. In other words, for CSS, this style is not as important as the style that we have right here. So this is taking more precedence over my sort of dynamic class here. So what we can do is we can basically apply the good old CSS slap that says important. So we put an exclamation here. We go back to the browser and you can see that the computer now understands what I'm trying to say. So we have this highlighted and we can switch, and this looks much nicer now. Well, that's pretty much it for this video. If you found this useful, please give a thumbs up. You have seen an early version of httpResource, and I'm only excited to see where this goes and how this changes how we work with reactivity with lesser code and more powerful experiences. And just to mention this again, as I've done before, I'm working on an Angular book that is based on signals, and it talks about a lot of things about signals, what the APIs are, and how to best use them even in practical situations. So you can find the link in the description of this video. Let me know in the comments what you feel about this video, and as always, happy coding. I'm gonna see you next time.